All right. Those of you think I've gotten too soft and recommending too much pop, there's a great rock show on the 14th at a little venue called the Middle East Upstairs, right down here in Central Square. There's just you, me, and our 60 most intimate friends rocking out this game called Schizophonics, which is sort of a very sort of retro rock show. So Buffett is a good representative of their music. So if you're more of a rock fan, check them out. All right, so today we're going to move on from the social insurance discussion to a sort of related but somewhat different discussion, which is discussion of redistribution. And to motivate this discussion, I use one, I think it's the most striking fact I've seen maybe in my life, certainly the last 15 years, which is facts that were put together after the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore. Some of you may remember the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore. These were in 2015. There was a black man who died while in custody of the police. There were huge riots because of police mistreatment of blacks in those neighborhoods in Baltimore generally. And someone looked at Baltimore and noticed a fascinating fact, which is the incredible degree of inequality within Baltimore itself. And there's no more striking illustration of that than Figure 17.1. Figure 17.1 shows for various neighborhoods of Baltimore. It's all just Baltimore. It's just the city of Baltimore, broken into neighborhoods. The average life expectancy by neighborhood. So, for example, if you look at the average life expectancy in Sandtown, Winchester, which is where Freddie Gray lived, it was 67 years. Okay, the U.S. average was about 79 years at that point. 67 years was lower than life expectancy of North Korea. Okay, it's an abysmally low number. If you go 3 miles away to the neighborhood of Roland Park, the life expectancy was 17 years longer. Think about that. 3 miles, and the average person there lived 17 more years. Okay, this was sort of a stunning fact. Now, consistent with that fact, it's just enormous inequality in these two areas. So, for example, the average income in Freddie Gray's neighborhood was $24,000 a year. The average income in the Roland Park neighborhood was $107,000 a year. Okay, in Freddie Gray's neighborhood, more than half the families were in poverty. In the Roland Park neighborhood, fewer than 10%. So basically, this is an incredible, to me, it's just an unbelievable illustration of inequality, a microcosm of inequality in the US. And it's not just Baltimore. So for example, in Chicago, the Streeterville and Englewood neighborhoods are only 8 miles apart, but have a life expectancy gap of 30 years. You go 8 miles, on average, people live 30 years less. Okay. And basically, if you just look at what happened with COVID, death rates in poor neighborhoods were 2.5 times the death rates in rich neighborhoods for this pandemic. So this raises a crucial issue for public finance, which is how should we feel about addressing these enormous inequalities? And here, there's sort of no doubt. There's sort of why, the question of sort of why should the government be involved is sort of the easiest one to answer, which is if you care at all about redistribution, clearly the private sector will not do enough. Redistribution is a classic public good. So think about a poor person begging outside the tea station, and you walk by and you figure, well, I give him money or someone else can give him money. So I'll give him less than I would give him if I was the only person who might help him out. So even with preferences for redistribution, there's a clear public goods problem in redistributing money from rich to poor. And as a result, if we think redistribution is necessary, there's no doubt that there's a role for government in doing so. So since this is the topic where the kind of easiest case answer to the why question. But it's only easy question to answer the why question if we actually think inequality is a problem. So let's actually start with some facts on what income distribution looks like in the US to put it in context and talk about how we think about inequality in our country. So there's 2 ways to talk about income, about incomes in our country. The first is relative income inequality. How much do the rich have relative to the poor? That's a common framework that's used to talk about inequality in the US, is how much the rich have relative to the poor. And that's illustrated, for example, in table 17.1. Okay, so in table 17.1, there's a typical quintile distribution table of the kind we see when we think about income distributions. Each row is 1/5 of the population. So a perfectly equal distribution of income
where income is distributed, where every person has the same income, each of these cells would be 20. In fact, of course, the cells for the highest quintiles are much larger than those for the lowest quintiles. So in 1967, for example, the richest 20% of people had 44% of the income. The poorest 20% of people, same number of people, okay, only had 4% of the income. The time pattern is interesting. From 1967 to 1980, you see actually inequality got a little bit better. And then inequalities really exploded to the point where today, the richest 20% of the population has over half the income in society. And instead of having about 10 or 11 times what the poorest group has, they have more like 16 times what the poorest group has. So there's a large inequality. It's growing. And this table even understates it. If you look at figure 17.2, this shows the share of total income accruing to the top 1% of the population, the richest of the rich. If you can see that currently we're at a peak for the 20th century of about 25% of all income going to 1% of people. And you see that sort of back to where it was and above where it was in the early 20th century. The top 1% share fell as low as about 10% by the early 1970s before exploding again. So basically, we have a lot of inequality. It's been growing. Now, of course, there's never been a society in history where these numbers are all 20. And maybe the US, maybe it's just the sort of natural state of economics that there's this inequality. Well, to answer that, we can compare to other countries in table 17.2. What table 17.2 does is it shows different distribution points. The bottom 10%, the bottom 20%, bottom 40, top 20, and top 10%. Just some different distribution points across all of the OECD nations. These are sort of developed countries for a roughly comparable point in time. Okay, and what you see is the US is the most unequal nation on this list other than Mexico. And even with the Mexico, our records kind of mixed. We have the lowest share of income in the bottom 10% of any country, including Mexico. We have the highest share in the richest 10% of any country except for Turkey and Mexico. So basically, the US not only has high inequality, I mean, all these countries have feature inequality. The last column is multiples of the first column for every country. Okay, but the gap is the largest, or the ratio is the largest in the US. So we have very high inequality. Certainly, maybe we're more comparable to Mexico and Turkey than are to any other developed country. So that's one measure of how society is doing in terms of its distribution of resources, is the relative measure, which is inequality. But in economics, it's not clear why we care about that. Let's do a simple thought experiment. Let's say that I gave all the poor people in America $1 million or $10,000, and all the rich people in America $100,000. Inequality would go up, but would be worse off. Poor people would suddenly have a lot more to eat. And in some sense, isn't that what we care about? Yeah.
I assume we're not accounting for inflation.
We're not doing inflation. It's just a static point in time calculation. Okay, I'll come to inflation in a few minutes, actually. The bottom line is, in some sense, one view is we don't really, if the poor people can be brought up to have a decent standard of living, why do we care about how rich the rich people are? I mean, you can make an argument for caring about how poor the poor people are. They've got to eat. They got to have housing. They got to have clothes. But if they can meet those needs and have a decent standard of living, who cares how rich people get? And in economics, in fact, the standard economic model would say, actually, it shouldn't matter how rich the rich people are. It should just matter to make sure that the poor people are meeting some decent living standard. And that leads to a different concept of income distribution, which is not relative, but an absolute concept, which is how are the poor doing relative to an absolute concept of deprivation. And the concept we use in America, which I referred to a couple of times already, is the poverty line. The poverty line. Okay, the poverty line is actually, it's a fascinating history for those of us who sort of believe in the power of government bureaucrats. What happened was in the early 1960s, a low-level bureaucrat named Molly Orshansky was asked to come up with some sort of measure of what it meant to be poor. So she went and she said, look, the typical poor person spends about a third of their budget on food. So let me add up what it costs to eat a nutritionally adequate diet, multiply it by 3, and we'll call that a minimum standard of living or a poverty line. Well, that exercise, updated by the CPI, is today's poverty line. Literally trillions of dollars are redistributed based on this exercise Molly O'Shaughnessy did in the early 1960s. Okay? The poverty line itself is illustrated in table 17.3. Her calculations say that the poverty line for a single individual in 2020 was $13,000. Now, it doesn't go up linearly or multiplicatively with the number of people in the family. We assume that there are economies of scale in individuals living together. So we assume that it is less than twice as expensive for 2 people to live together because they can share rent, they can share pots and pans, etc., than it is for one person to live alone. So it goes up, but it goes up at a slower rate as families get bigger. Okay, so roughly speaking, the poverty line for a family of 4 is about twice the poverty line for an individual. Okay, so roughly speaking, think of a family being in poverty if they're below about $25,000 a year, $26,000 a year here. But to fix ideas, think about a family living below $25,000 a year is in poverty. Okay, now how you feel about that number? Well, actually, let me give some facts. So what do poverty rates look like? We see that in figure 17.3. Okay, in figure 17.3, we see poverty rates over time in the US. And what you see is overall, that's the red line. Poverty rates came down a lot in the 1960s and have basically remained fairly flat since then. Now that masks a little bit of the trends. Poverty rates came down a ton for the elderly and actually went up for kids. But the bottom line is, in this period from 1980 to 2020, when inequalities exploded, poverty's not. Poverty stayed pretty flat. So how you feel about what's happened to income distribution in America depends very much on how you feel about whether we should care about relative income inequality or absolute income inequality. Now, there's 2 caveats. So first point is the economic measure, the measure we should come and care about from 1401 perspective would be absolute poverty. And that would say, well, things may be bad, but they're not getting worse. Okay, but there's 2 important caveats to that. The first caveat is the poverty line itself. Someone mentioned inflation. There's a number of reasons why taking the cost of food in 1963, multiplying it by 3 and calling it the poverty line, just updated by general inflation, is not the right thing to do. First of all, inflation has been differential across categories of goods. In particular, food inflation has been much slower than inflation in other necessities such as medical care and housing. So today, if you look at a typical poor person, food is about 1/6 of their budget, not 1/3 of their budget. Yeah.
No, when I had talked about inflation, I was referring to how, like, if you give everybody free money.
Oh, they'll spend more money. Yeah. This isn't a macro class. Put your macro away.
Right.
We assume full employment, all that stuff here. Okay, so basically, the first problem is that's not a relevant calculation anymore. And basically, relative inflation over time has gotten much worse for the things poor people consume a lot of. Okay, so that's the first problem. Okay, the second problem is this does nothing about income differences across areas. So when I said a family living on $25,000 is line of poverty, if you're from the Northeast, you're thinking, geez, how can anyone function? 25, I mean, that's insane. If you're from rural Alabama, that doesn't sound like a lot, but you can still live on it. I mean, my wife's family is from rural Minnesota. Her cousin had a legitimate decision about 15 years ago whether to buy a car or a house because they're about the same price. They reach about $20,000. Okay. So in parts of the country, 25,000, nobody's rich on 25,000, but you can survive on 25,000 in rural Minnesota. You can't survive on it in Boston. But the poverty line is not regionally adjusted. There is a separate one for Alaska, because Alaska is particularly expensive. But other than that, it's not regionally adjusted. The third problem is it's a very incomplete measure. So for example, they don't count taxes. What you consume is your after-tax income, not your pre-tax income, but this is just based on your pre-tax income. It also doesn't incorporate in-kind benefits. So if you get free health insurance or free housing, you're effectively richer, but that's not included in here. Okay, so there's a number of problems, okay, with measuring the poverty line. And indeed, in the early 1990s, the National Academy of Sciences did a report and recommended an alternative way of measuring the poverty line. They said, look, we should account for these changes and different things, and here's how we should measure it. Now, the good end of the story would be, well, then the government adopted it. The real story is the following. When I was in the government, I had an amazing assistant. Like, the government gives you incredible assistants. And this woman always told me where I was going, why I was going there, what I should be doing. One day she called me and said, John, this has never happened before. I'm totally befuddled. They called a meeting for you. They won't tell me what it's about or where it is. Like, maybe we're at war or something. I don't know what's going on. Like, this is really weird. So someone came and got me and like escorted me. I had no idea where I was going or what it's about. They took me to like a top secret soundproof room. And they brought me and said, we're here to discuss the measurement of the poverty line. It's like, what the fuck? Why? Because of the politics. Think about what would happen if we redid the poverty line the way we should. Well, for example, groups that lived in poor areas would suddenly look richer. Groups that received a lot of government benefits would suddenly look richer. Okay, so for example, Black poverty rates would fall enormously, white poverty rates would go up. That's pretty politically dangerous to walk around and say we should change the poverty line to basically massively change the racial composition of who gets government benefits in America. And the politics was so worrisome, they didn't want anyone to know we're even discussing it. As a result, we've not changed the poverty line. Now, they do report the alternative poverty. The good news is, through good government issues, we got them to at least report what the poverty line should be. Okay, but basically, it's unfortunately we stay with the same measure. So the first problem is saying, well, just all we should care about is poverty. The first thing is we don't measure poverty right. The second problem is more fundamental, which is it's not entirely clear we shouldn't care about relative inequality. Relative inequality actually, in many ways, does matter. So, for example, how we define what it means to be poor sort of depends on what the rich have. So in 1950, if you didn't have a car or a TV, you weren't necessarily considered poor. But if you don't today, you're poor. Okay, so the idea is that the other problem with the poverty line is, in some sense, poverty is relative. It's really about where you stand relative to the consumption model we consider acceptable in America. You can't get to a job without a car now. Okay, so the idea is that poverty should incorporate whether you should have a car, et cetera. That's a relative measure. So that's the first problem with just saying relative doesn't matter. The second problem is that basically people care about relative income. And this starts to get into difficult welfare economics, which is what do we do about the fact that actually, by all objective evidence, utility functions incorporate relative income. This isn't just people, this is primal. Okay, so for example, did an experiment where they, on a set of monkeys, where they taught them to hand over pebbles in exchange for cucumber slices. So they gave a pebble and they got a cucumber slice. And that was a good deal for them. The monkeys were happy to do it. Then one monkey was given an even better deal. He could hand in his pebble for a grape, which is better than the cucumber slice. We can't argue with that, right? Monkey or not. Okay. Then they went back to the second monkey and said, hey, would you like your pebble, trade your pebble for cucumber slice? He said, no. The monkey turned it down because he viewed it as unfair that the first monkey got the grape and he was still getting cucumber slices. Okay. Fairness is ingrained in our DNA. Okay. There's a number of studies which show that at the human level. So for example, if you ask what happens to you holding your income constant when your neighbor gets richer, is it makes you sadder. So happiness depends positively on absolute income, but negatively on relative income. So they did a program in Kenya where they transferred money to people and found the people who got the transfers were happier, but all the other people in the village were sadder. Okay. And perhaps the most striking finding in this arena is actually an incredible study where they looked at lottery winners in Canada. And they found that neighbors of lottery winners were more likely to go bankrupt. Now, lottery is random. Why are they more likely to go bankrupt? Because they suddenly wanted to spend more to keep up with the lottery winners. Suddenly, their neighbors had nicer cars, so they had to buy a nicer car. Okay? clearly relative income matters in a deep sense. If the goal of economics is if the goal of government policy is to maximize well-being, and people care about relative income, then maybe the government should too. So those are reasons why it's not obvious that the simple 1401 answer of just it's only absolute poverty matters. Relative may matter as well. Okay? Questions about that? Okay, given that income distribution is wide in the US and we may want to address it, okay, how do we do so? Well, we do so through a host of transfer programs in the US. Now, we have approximately 937 transfer programs in the US, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm just going to go through a couple of key types of transfer programs. I want to draw two key distinctions that you need to keep in mind. You don't need to remember the specific programs, but you need to keep in mind these two key distinctions. The first distinction is between categorical versus means tested. A categorical welfare, okay, by the way, now, when I say welfare now I mean redistribution. I don't mean well-being. So welfare has this double meaning in this class. When I say welfare up to now, I'm talking about social welfare. Now when I say welfare, I mean programs that transfer across people. So I'll try to use transfers when I can, but if I skip into welfare, that's what I mean. Think about a transfer program. There's two ways to target it. One is you can target it on how poor someone is. The other is you can target it on stuff about them. So for example, Medicaid expansions today are a purely means tested transfer. You have to be below 133% of poverty. They used to be a categorical transfer. You had to be a single mother and poor. There's very few things which are purely categorical, but none of our policies are both categorical and means tested. Actually, relatively few of our policies are just means tested. Many of them are both categorical and means tested. The second distinction, which is in the description, is cash versus in kind, which is, do we give people cash or do we give them goods, medical care, housing, food, etc. Okay. So I want to talk about, within the world of cash transfer programs, there's a few very most important programs you need to know about. Like I said, there's hundreds, but the few that are most important you should know about. The first is TANF, or Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. This is the classic cash welfare program. People talk about welfare moms and the welfare system, etc. This is what they're talking about. This is a program for low-income families with no earner. Technically, it's for low-income single-parent families. Generally, it's for low-income single-parent families. Technically, dual-parent families can get it, but almost none do. So think of this as a low-income single-parent family. Moreover, I think it was a low-income single mom program because there aren't a lot of single dads. It's basically a program for low-income single moms. And by low income, we mean very low income. Basically, in Alabama, to qualify for this program, your income has to be below $204 a month. Okay, add that, do the math in your head, that's $2,400 a year. That's like a tenth of the poverty line. Okay, that's for a family. Okay, so this is for very, very low income people. In no state can you get this if you're even at the poverty line. Every state is below the poverty line, some states well below the poverty line. So it's for the very poorest families. The way it works is if you qualify, you get a benefit guarantee. You get a certain amount that's if you have zero income. So zero income, you get a benefit guarantee if Y equals 0. But as your income goes up, they reduce the amount you get. So essentially, there's what's called a benefit reduction rate. So as your income goes up, they lower the money you get. So the most you can get is G, but as your income goes up, it falls. And once your income hits, say, $204 a month, it goes to 0. So it's both capped and also depends on the income you have. Okay, is how it works. Okay, this is a program which is state run, but once again, a federal match, just like with Medicaid, there's a federal match. So that's TANF. The other big cash program is SSI. So TANF's about a $20 billion a year program. SSI, this is basically disability for people who don't qualify for DI. So like kids who are disabled, or people who don't get an earnings history, people who are disabled before they can get a career going. People are basically too poor to get on DI, get on SSI. So it's basically, it's categorical and in kind. So TANF is categorical kind, you gotta be like a single mom and poor. SSI to be disabled and poor. Okay. And if you are, you get a transfer. You get a transfer that program, and this is much bigger. This is about a $60 billion. So if TANF is about a $20 billion year program, this is about a $60 billion year program. But it's much less politically controversial because people think people on this program are disabled, this program are lazy. We'll come back to that. Okay, it's much less politically controversial. Finally, probably the biggest cash or complicated is the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. We're not going to talk about that now, but just to mention, that's probably the biggest cash. It's about 60 billion. It's about the same size as SSI. So that's actually, it's bigger. I think it's closer to 100 billion. So this is really sort of the biggest cash transfer program. It's basically a tax break you get based on your income. And we'll come back to that when we talk about taxes. But those are the big cash transfer programs. Meanwhile, in terms of in kind, okay, the biggest in kind program, of course, is Medicaid. That dominates all other welfare programs. That's about a $700, $800 billion a year program. So it's multiple times as large as the next biggest program. And we talked about Medicaid. That's health insurance for the poor. Should be easier. We're talking about poor people. Okay, health insurance for the poor is Medicaid. We've talked about that. But there's a number of other in-kind programs. We have SNAP, which is essentially a debit card you can use to buy food. If you're poor, if you're below the poverty line, they give you a debit card you can use to go buy food. There's public housing. And public housing comes in two types. There's both public housing buildings, the projects. Okay, but increasingly they're getting rid of the projects and replacing them with public housing vouchers, which are essentially coupons you can take to rent a private apartment. Essentially, instead of living in a public building, they give you a coupon. So if you're poor, you get a coupon that you can go take to a landlord to give you money off your rent. Or it caps how much you have to pay for rent. Okay, and then there's other nutritional programs like school lunch and breakfast. You may have been, or you may know people who are getting free lunch or breakfast in school. There's what's called the Women's Infants and Children Program, which gives free milk and dairy products to women and their newborns, etc. So there's a number of cash in-kind programs. Medicaid's the giant program, but we have a wide variety. Yeah.
Do landlords have to accept the vouchers?
Say it again.
Do the landlords have to accept the vouchers?
Excellent point. I want to come back to that in a few minutes. Okay. So let's talk about how transfer programs work, and in particular, why we have all these different transfer programs. Why don't we just have one big transfer program? You're poor, you get money. Why do we have all these? Okay. So let's start in a simple world where transfer programs are simply of the form, you're poor, you get money. Okay. Let's start in the simple world. Okay. And in that world, what we want to do is ask, what essentially is the equity efficiency trade-off? Remember, fundamentally, we learned in 1401 that essentially the perfectly competitive equilibrium maximizes the size of the pie, but it might not lead to a very fair distribution of the pie. Redistributing the pie generally is going to lead to inefficiency. And the question for a social welfare planner, is how much inefficiency am I willing to put up with to get a better distribution of income? Now, the best way to think of this is an incredible thought exercise derived by Arthur Okun, who was a famous economist. He was the head of John F. Kennedy's Council of Economic Advisors, very famous economist. Arthur Okun said, look, here's how to think about it. Imagine that the way we got money from the rich to the poor was the rich people put money in a bucket. We'd walk along, carry the bucket, and then dump it out in front of poor people. Okay? Now, in that world, if I asked you, if the rich person put in $1 and the poor person got the $1, would you support that? The answer is 97% of Americans would say yes. What if I told you that some leaked out along the way, such that with the rich person put in $1, but by the time it got to the poor person, it was only 90 cents. Would you still support it? Well, maybe 93% of Americans would say yes. You can keep doing the thought exercise. What if the poor person only got 80 cents, 70 cents? What if the rich person put in $1 and by the time I got to the poor person, it was 0? Now, some Americans would still support that. Indeed, if relative income inequality is what matters, that may still be okay. But probably most Americans wouldn't. So really, it's a great thought exercise to think about how we feel about income distribution. Now, what causes the leak in the bucket? Well, there's really 3 sources of leakage in the bucket. The first source, you got to pay someone to carry it. Okay. In other words, you got to have an administrative welfare state. Someone's got to write the checks. That's tiny. That's like, that's single-digit percent. The bigger sources of leakage are somebody has to pay the taxes, and taxes cause distortions. And we'll talk about that starting next lecture. And the person who gets the money suffers from potential moral hazard from the transfer. So the big source of leakage is, on the one hand, the deadweight loss from taxation, which is when the person puts in the dollar, some of it disappears through the effort of putting it in. And the other is a deadweight loss from the moral hazard transfers, which is I might make myself poor to qualify for the program. And those are the big sources of leakage in the bucket. So today we're going to focus on the second source of leakage, which is the transfer leakage. Okay, so let's talk about the moral hazard cost of a means-tested welfare system. Imagine we had a purely means-tested welfare system. Okay, and the way that would work is we'd simply say the benefits you get are some guarantee minus some implicit tax rate times your income. For TANF, this is called the benefit reduction rate. Well, benefits are actually the min of that, comma, the min of that, comma, no, the max of that, comma, 0. Max of that, comma, 0. Okay, so no one gets negative benefits. You get 0 if your income gets too big. Okay, but basically that's a welfare program. You get the max of that or 0. Okay. Now, in that system, we can model how that would affect people's labor supply decisions. So let's make this example simple. Let's assume TAW equals 1. And let's assume that all income comes from labor supply. So then we can go to an analysis like in figure 17.4. So figure 17.4, okay, imagine individuals have a choice of how hard to work. We have a standard consumption leisure diagram. On the x-axis is leisure. You can take up to 2,000 hours a year of leisure. On the y-axis, consumption. Imagine people make $15 an hour. Okay, imagine people make $15 an hour. So the choice is they can either work 2,000 hours a year and have $30,000. That is 0 leisure and 30,000 consumption. That's the y-intercept. Or they can not work at all and have no consumption. That would be the x-intercept. Or some choice in between. The line has a slope of $15. Okay? Standard leisure consumption trade-off. Now imagine the government comes and introduces a program where G is the poverty line. And let's say the poverty line, G is 12,760 and TAW is 1. G is 12,760, TAW is 1. So introduce this, we're going to throw this welfare program on top of your consumption leisure decision. What does it do to your budget constraint? Well, basically, if you are to the left of 1,149 hours, it does not affect your budget constraint. Because at that point, your earnings is such that welfare is sort of an irrelevant option to your budget constraint. But if you earn anything less, if you work anything less than 1,000, or if you take any more than 1,149 hours of leisure, your budget constraint becomes flat. Okay, so the point is your income is always at least 12,760, no matter what. It can be more by working more. So your income is always at least 12,760. If you take less than 1,149 hours of leisure, you can make your income more. But your income can never be less because we've guaranteed a minimum. So your new budget constraint goes A, B, D. Okay? Now, let's look at 3 individuals. This should look familiar to from sort of the Peltzman analysis we did earlier with education. Let's take 3 individuals and ask how it affects their decisions. Well, for individual Z, it does not affect the decision. Individual Z likes consumption enough that they're not willing to go on the welfare program. For individual X, it increases both their leisure and consumption. Individual X is a no-brainer. They can work less and consume more. So it's a no-brainer. Individual X is going to move to point D. Okay, that's a no-brainer. What about individual Y? Well, that depends on their tastes. If their indifference curve, individual Y, by the way, starts with an income of 14,000, taking 1,067 hours a year of leisure. In the way I've drawn it, it's sort of hard to read. It's hard to get this diagram to work well. The indifference curve crosses through the horizontal line from B to D. Given that, individual Y is on a higher indifference curve at point D. So individual Y also moves to point D. Doesn't have to be so. If their indifference curve was such that it did not cross that horizontal segment, they would not. Okay, but it's such that it does, and so they move to point D2. So what the welfare program has done is it's caused all people X to quit their jobs and all people Y to quit their jobs. So suddenly, the welfare program has cost a lot more than you thought it would. The welfare program has cost a lot more than you thought it would. Okay, because suddenly you're getting more people. I do a little estimate in the book. I say if you ignored the fact that people like X and Y quit, you could end poverty in America for $150 billion a year. More realistically, it's more like $400 billion a year. Okay, because of people like X and Y. So bottom line is this is a very big impact. This moral hazard response to getting a transfer, it's very big. It's a classic moral hazard because basically you are benefiting by being poor, which causes people to take actions to become poor. In this case, those actions are great because then they get more leisure too. So it's a real no-brainer. Okay? Now you might say, well, I have an easy answer to that, John. A T of 1 is nuts. You never want 100% tax rate, just like you never want 100% replacement rate. Why don't we just cut TAW? Why don't we just make TAW, for example, 0.5? And then there'll still be a marginal incentive to work. Right now, there's no incentive to work for person X. We'll give them an incentive to work by making TAW 0.5. Well, it turns out that doesn't solve the problem, as you see in figure 17.5. Figure 17.5 is a system where we have the same guarantee of 12,760, but we lower the benefit reduction rate to 50%. The new budget constraint goes from A, B to D. It intersects the Y, the budget constraint at a higher point, okay, but it ends at the same point D. Now, the good news is person X now will not fully quit because there's still a marginal return to work. Before there was a zero return to work. If you're going to work, if you were going to earn less than 12,760, you should work not at all because 100% tax rate. So now the not 100% tax rate. So person X works more. Okay. Also, person Y works a lot more. Because before, if person Y wanted to work a little bit less, he might as well quit. But now there's still a return to work. So person Y works a lot more. So we've actually reduced the moral hazard for X and Y. What's the problem? We've now introduced moral hazard for person Z. Person Z used to be unaffected by the system. Now they're in. So in fact, it's not obvious you've made things better. X and Y work more, but Z now works less because Z suddenly faced a 50% tax rate they didn't face before. The system used to be irrelevant to them before. So in fact, it's not obvious that you can make things better. Indeed, we have sort of an impossibility problem here, which is the government really has three goals. Okay? The government has three goals. It wants to encourage work. Okay? It wants to lower the cost of the welfare program, wants to spend less on welfare, and it also wants to redistribute income. The problem is there's three goals, but it only has two tools, G and TAW. And it's impossible to meet all three goals simultaneously by only working with two tools. You can show yourself with various combinations of starting from figure 17.4, the classic 100% tax rate case. There are no combinations of G and TAW that you can introduce that will help you along all three dimensions. They'll help you along one or two of them, but you can never improve along all three dimensions. Not surprisingly, you have three goals and two tools, you're under-identified. Okay, you can't make it work. And that's a fundamental problem with just using a pure cash welfare program. The fundamental problem with the pure cash welfare program is there's an impossibility theorem. You can't meet all your goals. Yeah.
Doesn't that assume that there are people at
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. This is much like ours impossibility theorem. It's not saying that democratic institutions will break down. It's saying you can't prove they won't. It's an impossibility theorem. It's impossible to prove that for sure you can improve all three goals changing G and T. But certainly you may be able to. You just can't prove you will. Okay? So basically, that is why welfare policy gets interesting. If this wasn't true, redistribution would be easy. We would just have a system where basically we give you whatever G and a TAW and we'd be done. But in fact, the reason we have lots of wrinkles in our transfer program systems is to try to get around this problem. So what I spend the rest of the lecture talking about is what are the ways that the various wrinkles in our transfer system try to get around this problem. Okay? So I want to talk in particular about basically 5 different ways we have for trying to get around this problem. The first, so sort of five potential solutions, or if you will, five additional instruments. Like I said, the problem is we only have 2 policy instruments and 3 goals. There's sort of, if you will, 5 additional instruments we can try to bring to bear, and each comes with costs and benefits. The first is categorical welfare. Imagine that the way the world worked is that each of us, imagine there's 2 types of people, lazy and unable. And the goal of welfare policy is to basically help the unable without causing moral hazard among the lazy. Well, if we were all born with an indelible tattoo that said lazy or unable or neither, we wouldn't have a problem. We'd simply give the money, we'd give $12,760 to the unable, and we'd say, fuck you, the lazy, because we know they can earn it. They're not unable. So the idea of categorical welfare is to say, can we, in some sense, get around the moral hazard problem by tying the money to things which are unchangeable underlying characteristics of people? That's the idea. Okay? So, for example, consider a program that redistributes based on disability. That's the idea, is we say, look, we don't know that all poor people are lazy, but disabled people can't work. So if we give money to disabled people who are poor, we know they're poor because they can't work, not poor because they're lazy. But as we talked about in chapter 14, this disability doesn't always mean that there's no moral hazard. Indeed, we have empirical evidence that there's some moral hazard in disability qualifications. So basically, a good targeting mechanism essentially tries to meet 2 goals. The first goal is that it's immutable, it's unchangeable. People can't change it to try to engage in moral hazard behavior. The second is that it's correlated with need. And that's important. So for example, imagine I announced the following welfare program. Everyone who was last year the CEO of a Fortune 500 company gets $1 million. That would be immutable. No one can change whether last year they're CEO of a Fortune 500 company. It wouldn't be a very good welfare program because that's not very correlated with need. It's sort of inversely well correlated with need. Okay? So the point is you want something which is both unchangeable and tied to being in need. And that is why we ended up with the TANF program. Because single mothers are very poor as a group. The poverty rate in single mothers is about 2.5 times the poverty rate for married couples. And the view was that that was an unchangeable characteristic. No one wanted to be a single mother. So that's why we set up a welfare program for single moms. The problem is, a lot of people argued that that moral hazard assumption was wrong. And indeed, there was a very famous book by Charles Murray, who was a sociologist in the 1980s, that basically argued that, in fact, we were destroying society by creating single moms through a welfare program. And so what he did is he just looked at the data. So I want you to take figure 17.6 and hold your hand at about 1980, at about 1985, 1984. Block out everything to the right about 1984. If you do that, you see a very strong negative correlation between the green line, which is single motherhood, and the red line, which is transfer benefits. So Charles Murray, writing at that time, said, look, our welfare program is causing single motherhood. Therefore, we should cut back on welfare. And therefore, he said single motherhood is a bad targeting device. Well, that has led to an enormous literature, starting with just noting that, in fact, if you take your hand away, that negative correlation no longer exists. But more generally, using the kind of quasi-experimental methods that we talked about to try to investigate whether more generous welfare causes more single motherhood. And the answer is it does not. The answer is there's no consistent evidence that more generous welfare benefits cause more people to have children out of wedlock. In other words, not surprisingly. Now, welfare benefits are never huge. Maybe if we gave them $1 million, it would. But the several $100s a month we're giving does not seem to be enough to induce people to have children out of wedlock. So Murray was wrong, and this is a good targeting device. Okay, it is interesting. It does lead to more single female-headed households. Why? Because the one margin we respond to is they move out from living with their parents. So women already have kids, when they get on welfare, start to live on their own rather than their parents. Now, is that moral hazard, or is that like good for both parties involved? You tell me. So that's not really the right measure. The right measure is, are people having kids to qualify for this? The answer is no. Okay, so it looks like that is a good targeting device. So that's one way we can try to get around the moral hazard problem. Okay, questions about that? The second way we can try is through the use of in-kind benefits. These are the in-kind benefits. Okay, now, why do we give people food and shelter and healthcare instead of cash? Well, the main reason is paternalism. The main reason is we think that basically poor people don't know how to spend their money. We need to tell them how to spend their money, so we're going to give them this. Okay, but there's actually an economic rationale for doing it, even if you're not paternalistic, which is the flip side of the categorical welfare system. The idea of categorical welfare was to select the people who were truly neediest. The idea of in-kind benefits is to induce self-selection of those who are truly neediest. That is, we can't tell who's truly needy, but we can get them to reveal themselves. And the way we get them to reveal themselves is by giving them something that only poor people would want. If you give away cash, everyone lines up to get it. If you give away a shitty public apartment, the only people who really needed housing are going to line up to get it. So basically, the idea of in-kind benefits is to set up what we call an ordeal mechanism. An ordeal mechanism. The idea of the ordeal mechanism is basically, ironically, we're going to make poor people better off by making them worse off. What I mean by that is by making poor people worse off, giving them stuff that isn't great, we'll weed out the people who don't need it and therefore have more money to give to people who do need it. Okay, and that's the idea of an ordeal mechanism. Let me give you a simple example. It's in the book. Okay, imagine the government runs a soup kitchen. Okay, and it wants to just give soup to poor people. Okay, and the government can either hire more workers for the soup kitchen so no one has to wait outside, or hire fewer workers and make people wait outside to get the soup. Now, we'd say, well, sure, you'd never, unless it's in Seattle where it's raining all the time. Okay, you never want to make people wait out in the rain. You certainly have more people trying to get soup, but that's actually not obvious. So for example, imagine that there's two types of people, low ability and high ability. And you want to give the soup just to the low ability. You don't want to give it to the high ability. Let's say the utility functions on the utility low, let's say people's utility have two elements. It's basically how much soup they get and how long they have to wait. So let's say low ability person's utility function is 240S minus W. That is, every bowl of soup gives them 240, but every minute they wait gives them -1. S is number of bowls of soup, W is waiting in minutes. And let's say utility of the rich person, utility of the non-lazy person, of the high ability person It's not lazy, it's a high ability. This is low ability and high ability. The utility of the high ability person is different. It's 120S. They value soup less because they can always get soup on their own if they have to. Minus 2W. They value waiting. They care more about waiting because they have something else they can do with their time. Now, imagine you have these utility functions, and let's say there's equal number of people in each group. Okay? Suppose the government has a utilitarian social welfare function. So they don't care more about poor and rich. They just care about the sum of the two. I don't want to cook this example. Purely utilitarian social welfare. They just care about the sum of poor and rich. Okay? So let's say the government starts with a system with no waiting time. With no waiting time, both types will come and they'll split the soup. Okay? So let's assume they each get one. Let's assume there's 2 bowls of soup. Okay? With no waiting time, they'll each get one because they'll both show up. With no waiting time, they want soup and they want soup. So each get 1 bowl of soup. So the utility of the low is 240. And the utility of the high is 120. And total social welfare is 360. Now imagine instead, we have a system where we announce ex ante, you must wait 61 minutes in the rain to get soup. I'm telling you right now, I don't care how many people are here. We're making you wait 61 minutes. We are making you wait 61 minutes in the rain to get your soup. What does the rich person then decide, the high ability person decide to do? They bag it. They don't show up because 2 times 61 is greater than 120. So like, it's not worth it to me. The poor person's like, you assholes, but I might as well wait in the rain. It's still worth it to me. So what do they end up with? They end up with 2 bowls of soup. So their utility goes from 240 to 480 minus 61 or 419. The utility of the rich of the high ability goes to 0. And total social welfare goes up. Society is better off. Total social welfare has gone from 360 to 419. We've made poor people better off by making them worse off because of the self-selection. By imposing the ordeal mechanism, we've expanded the budget available. So while we've made their life more difficult, we've had more total money to give to them. And that's the idea of in-kind benefits, is when you give away money, everyone wants it. We give away stuff that isn't money, only people who really need it want it. And therefore, you can target it more effectively. And that's the idea of in-kind. That's why we have in-kind benefits. That's why I also have,
Does this feel problematic for like social mobility? Like if you're forcing the poor to wait in line, then maybe they have less time to like spend a job.
That's a great question. That's a great point. So in some sense, that's why what welfare programs do is they don't impose you wait in line. They impose that if you want welfare, you either have to have a job or be in a training program. So basically they impose that you have to go to work. So people who are just lazy are like, forget it, I won't qualify for welfare. So if you want, so we make you with an ordeal, you have to go get training. That's an ordeal, but it's sort of a selection device that's actually productive. It's supposed to, you're saying this is a destructive selection device. That's a more productive selection device. Good question. Other questions? Now, there are lots of other pros and cons of in-kind benefits. I have a whole 2-page box on this, okay, of in-kind benefits. One of the most interesting ones, you can read the box, one of the most interesting ones is a study done in developing, there's 2 interesting points about in-kind benefits. One is they did a study in developing country. The study was in Mexico, and they randomized villages. And they randomized, some villages got cash and some villages got an equivalent value in kind of food. And looked at what happened. And what they found was the in-kind benefits offered an advantage over cash beyond the self-selection because they're giving everyone anyway. So the self-selection wasn't there, which is that they affected the market. So basically, when you give people cash, it's actually the inflation point back here. So we'll do a little bit of macro. When you give people cash, that raises the price of goods because people then go try to buy more goods. If you give them goods, that lowers the price of goods because you've increased the supply. So actually there's an extra benefit, which is by giving out goods, you actually induce the market in a complementary way. By giving out cash, you induce the market in an oppositional way. So that's kind of a clever argument for why transferring goods might make sense. Another argument, yeah.
How do you give out goods like the government have to purchase the goods? What do you mean?
Yeah, but the government puts it on a national market, gives it just to the poor people. So there's rich villages and poor villages. You go purchase it in the rich village and give it in the poor village. That's a good point, though. Okay, so that's one cool point. The other cool point was about public housing. We had a question here about public housing, and basically here, the question here was, should we have public housing buildings or should we give vouchers? And this has led to an incredibly exciting literature on neighborhood effects in economics. And Raj Chetty at Harvard and Larry Katz at Harvard are two of the big contributors to this literature. And the beginning of this was a very famous social experiment called the moving to opportunity experiment. What they did is they went into a housing project and they gave people in the project a voucher. They said, if you want to move out of the project, they randomized. Said, if you want to move out of the project, here's a voucher to move out. But they gave two kinds of vouchers. One was, here's a voucher to move wherever you want. The other was, here's a voucher, but you could only use it to move to a low poverty neighborhood. What they found was, when they didn't restrict the voucher, it didn't do any good because people just moved next door to an apartment and they were still in the same crappy neighborhood and didn't improve their outcomes. But if they imposed the ordeal that to get the voucher, you had to move away from your friends and family to a low poverty neighborhood, outcomes improved. Not so much for the adults, but for the kids. I mean, the compelling story, they literally did ethnographic research. The compelling story said literally at the projects, the swings are over concrete and these nice suburbs are over grass and the kids got hurt less. Okay, it's stuff like that. Okay, that the parents' lives didn't change that much, but the kids' lives changed incredibly beneficially. And there's even been a long-run follow-up study showing how much better off the kids are from moving to these better neighborhoods. Yeah.
So this to better neighborhoods, right?
To better neighborhoods.
I heard you say to a worse neighborhood.
No, they chose to stay in the same, did I say worse? I meant better, to a better neighborhood, to a higher income neighborhood, lower poverty neighborhood. Okay, so basically what they found is that vouchers can work, but they also found the problem that you raised, there's also discrimination against voucher users. The voucher users also sometimes have a problem moving to low poverty neighborhoods because the landlords don't have to take the vouchers. It's like doctors and Medicaid. So there are some issues there in making sure that basically, so for instance, the Austin Tenants Council said that found that of the 78,000 units that qualify for Section 8 vouchers in Austin, only 8,000 accepted the vouchers. The other 70,000 say won't accept them. So with a building, at least you know what you're getting. It's a standard problem with privatizing. When you privatize, give the vouchers, the problem is you're relying on the private market to do its part. If the private market doesn't do its part, you're screwed. With the building, it's just a public enterprise. It's a standard make or buy problem for the government. We've talked about at length. When the government makes the buildings, it knows what it's got. It's got a building with an apartment, it can give it to you. When it tries to buy access to private building, it runs into the additional problems that are raised by the private sector participating. And that's the challenge. Yeah.
Why give vouchers for people to move to better neighborhoods when you could use that money instead to make that neighborhood?
Basically, that's a great question. Well, first of all, in this case, it was an experiment. There's a deeper question of should we, and indeed, Raj Chetty has this great research agenda showing the incredible importance of where you grow up to your later life circumstance. Turns out there's places where basically grow up in America can have 3- or 4-fold impacts on where you end up in the income distribution. And the question is, well, why should we be giving vouchers to people to move out versus improving those areas? And who would have something to say about that? Which economists we studied would have a view on this question? Thibault would have a view of this question, right? Thibault would say, well, the areas are the way people want them. And maybe some people are trapped in areas they don't want, so you should let them move out. But you shouldn't fundamentally distribute across areas. On the other hand, folks like Moretti, who talk about the fundamental equality across areas, say maybe we should redistribute across areas. So it's a standard problem we keep running into, which is people or places, which is a really interesting problem in economics. Okay. And here, I think the argument is a lot cheaper to do people than places, but then you leave other people behind. And that's the trade-off. Okay. Questions about that? All right. So that's the second way that we try to get around moral hazard. The third way, Okay, so we can try to target, we can try to self-select. The third thing we can do is we can increase outside options. That is, we can basically let people earn their way off welfare. So for example, imagine that we had a training program which could raise your wage from $15 an hour to $17.50 an hour and go to figure 17.8. Well, if people are earning $17.50 an hour, suddenly welfare is no longer attractive for person Y. Now, person X is still attractive, but for person Y, it's no longer attractive, and they don't go on welfare. So by increasing the options people have, you've solved all your problems. You've redistributed, you've helped people, you've lowered costs, and you haven't caused moral hazard. So the question is, how can we actually increase outside options? And there's a large number of ways that we've tried to increase outside options. One is through training. As I said, welfare programs now come with a requirement that if you want to get welfare, you have to engage in training. And these have been actually subject to dozens of randomized controlled trials. It's one of the most successful areas in terms of actually running randomized controlled trials in public policy. And the answer is meh. I mean, basically the answer is training is marginally cost effective in the sense that if you have training programs, people make enough more that it pays back the cost of training, but barely. And it doesn't really fundamentally move the needle on welfare participation. So it's a good thing to do, but it's not changing the world. It's not solving our problem. So that's one way you can increase outside options. A second way is you can raise the minimum wage. If people earn higher wages, they want to be on welfare. Now, we know there's a huge debate over the minimum wage. I talk about it some 1401. The bottom line, the minimum wage literature seems to be that for minimum wages up to the order of sort of $10 to $12 an hour, there's no evidence they lower employment. When wages get to where they are now, $15 an hour, there's more mixed evidence. But what's unambiguous is that higher minimum wages lower use of welfare. There's a lot of studies which show welfare, minimum wages go up, fewer people are on welfare. So it's not a fundamental driver of the minimum wage debate. It is another way we can increase out options. We pay people more, there'll be fewer people on welfare. Okay. Alternatively, we can, instead of just raise the minimum wage, we can be more targeted and have what we call labor market subsidies. We can subsidize work. We can try to offset the moral hazard from taxing work through welfare by subsidizing work. So of an offsetting distortion, if you will, an offsetting incentive, essentially what we see in these figures in the moral hazard is we're incentivizing leaving work through transfers. Let's incentivize doing work through subsidies. So that can be done in a couple of ways. The biggest subsidy we have, as I said, is the EITC. Once again, I'm just going to sort of hint at this. The Earned Income Tax Credit. The way this program works, essentially, it's a wage match program. If your income is low, for example, a two-parent family income is below $53,000. For every dollar you earn, the government will subsidize with additional money. The government essentially gives you a wage subsidy. So it's an offsetting. So while the welfare program is lowering your slope by taxing your labor supply, they're increasing your slope of your budget constraint by subsidizing your wages. Now that works, and I'll have very positive things to say about the EITC. Okay. The problem is it's really expensive. It's $64 billion a year. So as a tool to fight welfare, when TANF itself costs $20 billion, the idea that we should spend $64 billion to save money on a $20 billion program is not very compelling. The EITC is a good idea for other reasons, but it's a pretty broad tool to try to lower use of welfare programs. Instead, there's been a focus on more narrow subsidies targeted to those on welfare. So for example, they ran a program in Canada called the SSP. I forget what it stands for. And the way the SSP worked was the following. If you'd been on welfare for more than a year, you then qualified for a wage subsidy on a job. So if you've been on welfare more than a year, they qualify for generous wage subsidies, dollar for dollar. So those on welfare for more than a year, if they got a job at that point, for every dollar they earned, the government would match it with a dollar up to some point. And they randomized it. They ran a randomized trial of this program. And what they found was it was incredibly successful. They found this program was incredibly successful. If you look at, there was a almost 50% increase in the rates of leaving welfare and getting a job, leaving welfare and getting a job among the people who had these subsidies. So it's a very, very successful program and not that expensive because you only gave people on welfare. So it couldn't cost more than the welfare program. You only gave people on the welfare program. So this seems like an easy solution. Why not do this? Well, nothing's ever easy in this class. There's two problems with this solution. The first problem is it doesn't help people who aren't on welfare. So that's one problem is basically we're saying we only care about poor people who are on welfare. That seems kind of a narrow criterion. Okay. So that's the first problem. The second problem is it might induce people to get on welfare to qualify. So if I tell you, hey, if you're on welfare for a year, you're going to get this huge wage subsidy. Maybe people will join welfare to get the wage subsidy or stay on welfare longer to get the wage subsidy. That's what we call an entry effect. That's why economics is so annoying because there's never free lunches. Okay, there's this potential entry effect. But in fact, you can study that. And it looks like it's not big. Looks like the estimates of entry effects are not large. That is, people don't plan ahead enough to join welfare to get a wage subsidy a year later. So it looks like this is a very cost-effective plan. Indeed, if you look solely at the extra taxes generated by people working more, it paid for this program. This was a not only cost-effective program, it was a negative net cost program. But despite that, it's not something we've gone on and done here in the US, and I think they ended it in Canada too. It's hard to get people to do programs for the poor politically. Okay, so that's another way, increasing outside options. Okay, another form of increasing outside options is subsidizing childcare. Remember, if you think about someone, a single mom trying to make a living, what she cares about is the net of her wage minus childcare costs. So you can subsidize wages or you can reduce childcare costs. That should be symmetric. Subsidizing wages, reduce childcare costs have symmetric effects in terms of increasing incentives to go to work. And indeed, there are lots of really interesting studies which show that if you subsidize childcare, people are more likely to go to work. Okay, that basically subsidized childcare. I talk about all the various studies in the book. I don't have time to go into them now. But basically, the bottom line is subsidizing childcare gets people to go to work. Okay, but there's always a but. Is it a good idea? Well, that depends on what? Depends on whether it's good for the kids or not. It may get moms to go to work, but that's not all we just care about. We don't just care about kids going to work, about moms going to work. One thing is only a $20 billion a year program, Tanif. If it screws kids up, that could be a trillions of dollars problem for the future. So the question is, what does subsidizing childcare do to the kids? And here we have a vast literature that's really quite interesting. Basically, I go through it in the book, but the bottom line is there's strong evidence that high quality childcare targeted to poor people is incredibly valuable in improving the outcomes of their kids. They were in randomized trials. There's a program called Head Start in the US that does this. Various ways of studying it show that high quality childcare targeted to poor families is incredibly beneficial for kids. There's also studies that show that universal childcare, untargeted, is actually bad for kids. So I did a study in Canada. So the province of Quebec introduced a free childcare program, and we did a quasi-experimental analysis of what happened with the rest of Canada and found it was bad for kids in Quebec. Indeed, this was so controversial, my co-authors up in Canada got death threats from people who want years of childcare were very upset by this study. Glad I was safe here in the safe US with no death threats at all. Yeah.
So did you oppose then like the American Families Plan, like the part of that?
That was not, well,
Divided.
the American Family Plan targeted its childcare subsidies.
Oh, okay.
So the bottom line is, now why do we find negative effects in Canada? The answer, once again, comes back a bit to what we talked about with lowering class size in California, but it didn't work, which is there weren't enough good childcare teachers. So suddenly you basically had to hire a bunch of new childcare teachers who weren't very good. So maybe over time it'd be okay. It's also because basically the bottom line is a lot of the people who use childcare, it's not sort of, it's hard to say this in a non-judgmental way, but the bottom line is the home environments, which is the alternative to childcare, are basically more supportive of kids' development in higher income families and low income families. Low income families often have home environments that are less supportive of kids' development. So pulling a kid out of a low income home, putting them in childcare may be better for their long run out because it's pulling kids out of a high income home, putting them in childcare. And so as a result, what this suggests, much like we sort of the flat of the curve suggested we want to give people health insurance, but not too generous, this suggests we should subsidize childcare for low-income people, but not just have universal childcare. The American Families Plan actually probably went up too much. It was up to like $100,000. I would say a much lower number. I'd say like $40,000 in income. But the idea is a targeted childcare would make a lot of sense. Okay, so that's another way we can increase outside outcomes. Finally, the last way is actually a really interesting topic we don't talk enough about, which is child support. In the US, if you have a kid and no longer have to support them, you are supposed, and you have a higher earning, you're supposed to support the child support. So if your parents are divorced, the higher earning spouse is supposed to pay child support. If you have a kid out of wedlock, the father is supposed to pay child support, or if the father's earning more than the mom. The problem is actually little known, less than half of child support obligations in America are paid. Okay. And basically, as someone, there's a classic case we call the deadbeat dad, which is the higher earning father who takes off and never pays. My father-in-law is a deadbeat dad, so I'm very sensitive to this topic. Okay. But basically, if we could get more deadbeat dads to pay, then moms would have more money, wouldn't need to go on welfare. And it seems like that's sort of a win-win, right? You got these bad deadbeat dads. Let's make them pay, and they'll get women off welfare. The problem is, once again, it's not that easy. Because basically, a lot of the deadbeat dads are themselves quite poor. So think about what we're saying. We're saying if you don't go after the deadbeat dad, the mom gets welfare from the average state taxpayer. If you do go after the deadbeat dad, the mom gets money from a low-income man. Which is better? It's not entirely clear. Depends on your moral judgment of the deadbeat dads. If you're just sort of mad at them for being deadbeat dads, if you can discourage future deadbeat dadhood, then we should go after them. But on pure income distributing grounds, it's not clear we should go after them. Maybe we should get the money from the average taxpayer. It's better off than the deadbeat dad. So really the interesting trade-off here is the relative income distribution of the average taxpayer, the deadbeat dad, and the incentive effect on deadbeat dadhood. If that's a margin that's elastic, that as we go after deadbeat dads, we'll make less of them, then we should go after them. But if it's not elastic, deadbeat dadhood is just an innate, some guys are assholes and some aren't, then it may not be worth going after them. Maybe better just get the money from the taxpayer. Okay? Questions about that? Okay, I'm going to skip over this one point here, which is sort of too subtle. Let me go on to the last thing I want to cover, which is the most important change in welfare policy in my lifetime, which was the welfare reform of 1996. We had a Democrat president, Bill Clinton, but he decided that he really wanted to essentially have a more centrist Democratic Party. And part of that was recognizing that at least some of the people on cash welfare weren't actually that needy. This was heresy to say in the Democratic Party. But he said, look, we've got to recognize that some people are truly needy, some people are just lazy. And we should actually try to target this program more to the truly needy. So he decided to try to reform the welfare program in 1996. It used to be called AFDC. This may be the first year I've ever taught it where I didn't use AFDC by mistake. It's so ingrained in what I learned. It used to be called AFDC, what's now called TANF, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and basically was fundamentally changed in 1996. First of all, and most importantly, it was no longer an entitlement program. Before 1996, AFDC was like Medicaid. If you added someone to your welfare rolls, the federal government picked up half the costs or more than that in poor states. In 1996, they changed it. They made it a block grant. They said that whatever amount you get from the federal government at this point, we're going to keep giving you that amount, but no more. It's just going to grow up by inflation. So if you admit more, we turned it from what? From retrospective reimbursement to prospective reimbursement of states. Instead of saying the more people you put on welfare, the more money we'll give you, we said we're giving you a fixed amount. So you put more people on welfare, that's all on you, state. Okay? That was the first thing we did. The second thing is we set time limits. We said no one could be on cash welfare for more than 2 years at a time or more than 5 years over their life. Okay? And we made a number of other changes. Now, this was incredibly controversial. And indeed, most liberals, including myself, thought it would be a disaster. And the reason we thought it would be a disaster was quite simply, there was a long literature that showed that women on welfare did not seem to work harder when you made the benefits less generous, but that their consumption fell a lot. In other words, I did an article showing that there was enormous consumption smoothing benefits from welfare. My RA on that article, fun fact, is now the general manager of the San Francisco Giants baseball team. Fun fact. Okay. I did an article showing that there was very big consumption smoothing benefits of welfare. Others have done studies showing that when you cut welfare benefits, women didn't work it much harder. So you was holy shit, if we kick women off welfare, they're going to not be able to work and they're going to starve. And it was hugely controversial. And in fact, lots of people left welfare. If you look at figure 1710, this shows the pattern of welfare receipt over time in the US. And we saw it's a dramatic reduction in the number of people on the welfare system in the US. And guess what? It turned out to be okay. It turned out that the moms who left welfare, by and large, replaced the money they were losing from welfare with earnings. That actually, among low-income mothers, income actually went up, not down. That by and large, there appeared to be full crowd in of earnings to offset what they lost. Now, the question was, what happened? We predicted, based on decades of evidence, that these women, we'd shown over decades that when you cut welfare benefits, women didn't work any harder. Yet when you kicked them off, they suddenly worked harder and actually made more than they're making on welfare. And the lesson is that this is the weakness of quasi-experimental analysis. I mean, you won't find a bigger fan than me, or really experiments as well, which you only learn about the range you study. This is what Josh Angrist won the Nobel Prize for. Okay, we're saying when you do a study and you study a range of variation of benefits between $300 and $250 a month, you learn about what happens in that range. You don't necessarily learn about what happens way outside that range. And the answer is we mispredicted. Because women didn't work much harder, when you cut their benefits from 300 to 250, we assumed you cut them to zero, they wouldn't work harder either, and we were wrong. Turns out we cut them to zero, that's a totally different situation, and they go to work. And it was a really depressing in many ways event in the lives of people like me. I mean, good for the women, but basically the point is that we have to recognize that when there's a really fundamental change in the system, our models may not work. This was an issue with the Affordable Care Act. My microsimulation model I described last lecture was based on more marginal changes. It's a big question of whether I get it right when we actually went to the entire system. Turned out I largely did, but I think that was once again luck. Okay, but basically, we have to recognize there's a limit. As I said, I'm a big seller in this course of quasi-experimental methods. We have to recognize their limitations. And that's why we also advocate in economics the use of what we call more structural modeling. The structural modeling is to say, take those quasi-experimental results and put them in a broader model. In that broader model, they can let you predict more what will happen out of sample. Now, the prediction is only as good as the model. It's still not as convincing as what happens in sample. But if you're going massively out of sample, you can be misled by a prediction from what comes in sample. Let me cover one last thing, and then I'm going to stop. Universal basic income, the Yang gang. Okay, universal basic income. Okay, we don't have much time, so I'll just cut to the chase. Bad idea. Okay, bad idea because basically, good idea. The argument for it is really twofold. First of all, let's get rid of all this shit. Let's just go back to this. Let's just give poor people money. But let's get rid of this benefit reduction rate stuff by giving everyone the same amount. Okay, so we get rid of all this crap, ordeal mechanisms, people waiting in the rain, horrible things. We just give people money, and by giving everyone the same amount of money, what we call a lump sum, we also get rid of the moral hazard issue. Sounds good. And in principle, at small amounts, it is a good idea. But the amounts that Andrew Yang was talking about, like $12,000 per person per year, not really politically feasible. If you add that up, that's $3 trillion a year in the US. Okay, that's the cost of the US healthcare system. Okay, so not really feasible. Moreover, there is a role for targeting. Many of us feel strongly the system that would give Bill Gates $24,000 extra a year. Keep Elon Musk. Let's pick on him. We all hate him now. Elon Musk. Okay. $24,000 a year is not really a system we want imposed in the US. So basically, I was just trying to say bad idea. What I should say is universal basic income, the appeal of it you should understand, which is we go back to the simplest world, but get rid of the moral hazard. That's the appeal. The problem is we get rid of moral hazard, we also get rid of targeting. When you get rid of targeting, two things happen. It gets expensive and you don't target. You give money to rich people. And that's the trade-off. So the trade-off is we can get rid of moral hazard by not targeting. When we don't target, we raise the budget and we don't redistribute. Okay? Just a quick, and there's more in the book about that. So let me stop there. That is the end of the first 2/3 of the course. Next lecture, we start taxation, the last part of the course. Oh, and no section on Friday, right? No section Friday. Enjoy your Veterans Day.